US and EU launch rare earth counterstrike, China in crisis.
America and Europe unite. China's rare earth monopoly is crumbling.
US-EU alliance strikes back, China's rare earth chokehold under attack.
America leads rare earth coalition, China's export walls shatter.
For more than 30 years, China held the world by its wires, deciding who gets the chips, who gets the magnets, who builds the missiles, and who stays in the dark. Every phone, every car, every turbine, all traced back to Beijing's rare earth monopoly. Nations warned about it, corporations ignored it. The West kept buying until China tightened the export tap. That single move sent shockwaves through Washington, Berlin, Tokyo, a silent alarm that the age of dependence was over. Now, the response has arrived, fast, coordinated, and ruthless. The US and the European Union have joined forces in a new rare earth alliance, an industrial, financial, and strategic front aimed straight at the heart of China's mineral empire. Factories are shifting, contracts freezing, and Beijing is losing the one weapon it could never afford to lose: control. This isn't diplomacy anymore. It's retaliation built in laboratories, refineries, and boardrooms. And if the alliance works, the world's most powerful monopoly is about to implode from within. Let's rewind. Rare earth elements, 17 metals with names few can pronounce, are the quiet skeleton of modern technology. Neodymium in your phone's speaker, lanthanum in hybrid batteries, yttrium in missile guidance systems. And since the late 1990s, China has mined, refined, and supplied more than 70 to 80% of the world's total output. That dominance wasn't luck, it was design. Beijing flooded the market with cheap exports, drove competitors out, and locked up refining patents. By 2010, China's control peaked at nearly 97% of global supply.
Fast forward to 2025, China still holds around 63% of mining and nearly 90% of refining capacity, according to the US Geological Survey. But now that stranglehold is cracking, because last month, Beijing imposed new export licensing rules covering not only raw rare earths, but also high-tech processing equipment, the very machines used to purify metals for semiconductors and defense systems. That triggered the EU's emergency response. Brussels called for strategic coordination with allies, while Washington quietly expanded its Defense Production Act fund for rare earth projects. Within 72 hours, senior officials from the US Department of Energy, the European Commission, and the G7 Metal Security Group met in Brussels. Their goal? Break China's dominance before the next global shortage. The plan? Co-finance mining and refining projects across trusted partners, Australia, Canada, and Norway, and create a joint strategic reserve of critical minerals by 2026. Total budget proposed nearly $12 billion in the first phase, split between US and EU contributions. The United States already poured $450 million into MP Materials in California and Lynas Rare Earths in Texas, with Europe adding another 800 million euros through its Critical Raw Materials Act fund. Meanwhile, Norway's RETEC project is set to become Europe's first fully independent refinery by late 2025. Together, these moves could cut global dependence on Chinese processing by almost 25% within 3 years, a shift that would have been unthinkable 5 years ago.
So why does this matter to you? Because rare earths aren't just strategic, they're everywhere. A single electric vehicle needs about 5 kilograms of rare earth magnets. An F-35 fighter jet contains over 400 kilograms. When China cuts exports, prices skyrocket. Last time it happened in 2010, the cost of neodymium jumped 750% in 6 months. That shock alone slowed the global EV rollout and added billions to US defense contracts. Now imagine that same scenario hitting today's supply chains, except this time, the West has a counterpunch. Already, new plants are rising in Texas, France, and Finland. A rare earth processing hub in Dunkirk has secured $850 million in joint US-EU funding and will open in early 2026. Analysts at Bloomberg NEF estimate that Western refining capacity will double by 2027, pushing China's global market share below 60% for the first time in 3 decades. Beijing isn't staying quiet.
State-run outlets call the alliance an economic provocation. A foreign ministry spokesperson warned that the weaponization of supply chains will invite consequences. But behind the rhetoric, China's leaders know the numbers. Mining profits are shrinking. Domestic stockpiles are falling by nearly 6% per quarter. And global buyers, from Apple to Tesla to Raytheon, are quietly signing long-term contracts with non-Chinese suppliers. In short, the world is hedging against Beijing, and that hedge is turning into a front line. The rare earth race has become the clearest economic proxy for a larger power struggle between centralized control and distributed resilience, between the old supply order and a new strategic map drawn by Washington and Brussels. Every ton of metal now carries a political price.
But how far can this alliance really go? Can America and Europe truly unseat a system China spent decades building? And if Beijing decides to retaliate by targeting lithium, graphite, or cobalt, does the West have the industrial depth to survive its own counterstrike? Because this isn't just a story about minerals, it's about who owns the future itself. The machinery of the new alliance is already moving. In Brussels, ministers signed a memorandum creating a transatlantic critical minerals board, a joint intelligence cell tracking global supply, refinery output, and Chinese export shifts in real time. At the same hour in Washington, the Department of Energy released $230 million from its Defense Production Act funds to fast-track magnet recycling and rare earth separation inside U.S. borders. Numbers tell the story. Between 2020 and 2024, U.S. rare earth imports from China dropped from 78% to 53%. Europe's dependency fell from 98% to 71%. If new contracts with Australia and Canada stay on track, analysts at CRU Group say that by 2028, China's refining market share could slip below 55%, its weakest grip since the 1990s. For Beijing, that's not just trade data, it's a threat to national power, because in China's model, minerals equal leverage. When leverage evaporates, so does obedience.
So what does China do next? First counter, price war. Beijing is already subsidizing domestic mines in Inner Mongolia and Guangdong, cutting export prices by almost 20% to undercut Western projects. Second move, legal pressure. A new Mineral Security Act requires foreign companies to seek dual permits for any refining work using Chinese ores, even if done abroad. Third front, geopolitical coercion. China has quietly approached several African and Latin American producers, offering infrastructure loans for exclusive export rights. But the problem for Beijing is momentum. Once Western financing shifts, it rarely returns. And investors now see rare earths as de-risked assets, a category that didn't exist until the US-EU framework announced last week. Bloomberg Intelligence estimates $18 billion in private capital is already queued for non-Chinese refining projects through 2026. This alliance isn't just about minerals, it's about machines. Every Western fighter jet requires dozens of rare earth components, magnets for steering fins, scandium-based alloys for engines, yttrium coatings for infrared resistance. In the civilian sector, a single offshore wind turbine contains 2 tons of rare earth magnets. When you control the supply, you control the future of both energy and warfare. That's why the Pentagon signed a 5-year contract with Linus US worth $258 million to ensure steady domestic output for defense systems. Europe is mirroring it. France and Germany committed 3.2 billion euros for a green magnets initiative, integrating defense and EV supply lines to cut Asian inputs by half before 2030. If the plan succeeds, a jet engine built in Ohio and a turbine assembled in Bremen could share the same Western refined supply chain for the first time in modern history.
Every alliance creates winners and losers. For the US, it means jobs, roughly 22,000 expected across mining and refining by 2027, according to the National Mining Association. For Europe, it means political credibility, proof that strategic autonomy doesn't mean strategic isolation. For China, it means a sinking trade surplus. Rare earth exports brought $12.8 billion in 2024. That figure could drop below $8 billion next year if the trend holds. And there's a wild card, emerging players. Vietnam, Brazil, and Tanzania are suddenly courted by both sides. Each has massive reserves and wants to avoid becoming the next proxy in a mineral Cold War. In September, Hanoi signed a joint venture with General Electric to develop its Dong Pao mine, the first non-Chinese project to supply directly into the US-EU pipeline. But there's a shadow in this victory. Rare earth refining is toxic. Radioactive waste, acidic tailings, heavy metals leaching into groundwater. China tolerated it for decades because it valued control over cleanliness. Now, the West must face the same dilemma it once outsourced. Can America and Europe sustain a green transition while building dirty supply chains at home? The US EPA has already granted temporary exemptions for 2 refineries in Texas and California, allowing slightly higher thorium discharge limits until 2028. Critics call it environmental hypocrisy. Officials call it strategic necessity.
In the short term, expect turbulence. Prices for neodymium and dysprosium already spiked 15% after China's licensing move. That means costlier EV motors, wind turbines, and even headphones by early 2026. But as Western supply ramps up, the curve flips. More competition, lower long-term prices, and for the first time in decades, consumers won't be held hostage by a single country's policy. Moody's projects rare earth price stability by 2028 and predicts the global EV industry could save $42 billion in input costs over 5 years if non-Chinese supply scales as planned. For ordinary Americans and Europeans, that translates into cheaper tech and lower energy bills once the transition pain subsides. At its core, this fight isn't just about metals, it's about sovereignty. For the US and EU, the Rare Earth Alliance is a test case for a new kind of industrial democracy, where supply chains aren't weapons, but shared infrastructure. For China, it's an existential warning. Control built on monopoly can be erased by collaboration. And for the world, it's a signal that the next great divide won't be East versus West alone, but control versus resilience. Scenario 1, the alliance holds. China's share drops below 50% by 2030, and Western partners form a stable supply network across 5 continents. Result, global prices stabilize, manufacturing jobs return to North America and Europe, and Beijing's economic leverage shrinks by a third.
Scenario 2, retaliation spreads. China targets graphite or lithium, hitting battery production. Inflation rises, political blowback grows, and the alliance faces internal strain. This path leads to a long trade Cold War, manageable but costly. Scenario 3, technological breakthrough. If the US or EU crack magnet-free motor design or synthetic rare earth alternatives, China's advantage evaporates overnight. DARPA and the EU Innovation Fund already have $1.1 billion allocated to exactly that research. Every empire built on control eventually faces its mirror, cooperation. China's rare earth monopoly is cracking, not because of war, but because the world finally refused to play by its rules. Factories once silenced by scarcity are coming back to life. Alliances once fractured by self-interest are learning to share risk. And as refineries rise in Texas, Dunkirk, and Oslo, a new idea is emerging, that economic security is the real currency of the future. This is not the end of the rare earth story, but it is the end of a monopoly, and the beginning of something China never expected, a world that finally knows how to fight back.